Frank is a professor of management in the Johnson College of Business, and he is also a New York Times best-selling author, and his latest book is Under the Influence, Putting Peer Pressure to Work, and you can find him at Twitter at Econ Naturalist.
I'm going to try to display differences between two types of contagion. The book that you referred to, Marianne, is about behavioral contagion mostly, but we're all focused pretty much now on viral contagion. It turns out there are some important similarities between the two concepts. There's some differences too. I'll try to highlight those and then talk about some of the policy implications that come from the best theoretical thinking that we've managed to assemble so far about contagion generally. So one thing we know about behavioral contagion, first let me define it. It's the term that behavioral scientists use for the tendency for behaviors, ideas, and the like to transmit between people in much the same way that infectious diseases do. It's a very important process in understanding social behavior, and what we know is that one of the similarities is that, one of the differences between viral contagion and behavioral contagion is that visibility is a really important component in behavioral contagion. If you can't see somebody engage in a behavior, it's very difficult to be influenced by them engaging in it. And a particularly powerful example of that is solar panel installations. Studies have shown that if you can see them from your rooftop, neighbors are much more likely to initiate orders for their own solar panels than if they're installed on the back of the house where they're not visible from the street. And in this side, you see that the Google Project Sunroof aerial photos indicate houses with solar panels in red dots. If you look carefully, you'll see that the houses with red dots are almost in every case next to a house or across the street from one that also has a red dot. The houses that don't have red dots, those are the ones without solar panels. Those houses are isolated in clusters as well. The installation of solar panels is one of the very most contagious things that's been studied. The seminal early study of this issue was done in California. And what the authors found was that a new installation early in the process on day one would, within 4 months' time, on average, stimulate a second installation, one that wouldn't have occurred if neighbors hadn't seen the first one. That second one, then, in 4 months' time, generates another installation. So initially you have one, after 4 months you have two, after 8 months there are four, doubling every 4 months, so that after just 2 years, in one neighborhood alone, you see 32 installations that wouldn't have happened except for that first one having been installed. And so the contagion process is much wider than that even. People talk to family members and friends who live beyond their neighborhoods, and so we see the idea spreading there too, independently. Viral contagion is almost always a bad thing. You don't want to catch a virus. You try to avoid people who are visibly ill. So that's a distinction between viral contagion and behavioral contagion. The things we see in the way of behaviors and ideas are much more likely to be imitated than the things we don't see. With viruses, if we see any evidence of them, we try to avoid them. So that's a difference. Another key feature is that viral contagion being in almost every instance bad, that's not true of behavioral contagion. We know that in some cases it is bad. People are much more likely to smoke, for example, if more of their friends smoke. But in other cases, as in the solar panel example I just mentioned, it's absolutely a good thing if we see others behaving in a certain way. Another important common feature of both viral and behavioral contagion is that the interests of the individual are often squarely in conflict with the interests that we have as larger groups. The economist Tom Schelling had a great example. He asked, why is it that hockey players, when they're left to their own devices, always skate without helmets, and yet they will vote anonymously for a rule requiring them to wear helmets? If helmets are so great, he asked, why don't they just wear them? Why do they need a rule? And his answer gets the point across in a very clear way. It's that if you take your helmet off, you get a competitive advantage. You can see better, you can hear better, maybe you can intimidate your rivals more effectively by your willingness to risk skating without a helmet. If you take your helmets off and gain a competitive advantage, the other team's best response is to mimic what you've done. So the equilibrium is that everybody skates without a helmet. The risk of injury and death goes up for everybody, and yet still no one's odds of winning the contest are affected at all. It's just like when all stand to get a better view, nobody sees any better than if everybody had remained comfortably seated. And here we see a fundamental challenge to conventional rhetoric about freedom. Some people would complain that a hockey helmet rule violates the player's freedom to decide for himself whether to wear a helmet. Well, yes, that's true, but that's exactly the point of the rule. Players know that if they have the freedom to choose for themselves, they won't wear helmets, and that's a bad outcome. So when interests of individuals and groups coincide, fine, we can let people do what they want. When they're in conflict, often it's in our interest, and we recognize that, to adopt rules that tell us we can't do what we want to do as individuals. This is a very clear pattern that we see in both the COVID-19 arena and in the climate arena. So that in the case of COVID-19, what we know is that the best way to slow transmission of the virus is to engage in strict social distancing. Don't get any closer than 6 feet to another person, and stay home except on essential business. That's known to be effective, but the individual's interest is often to not accept the level of social distancing that would be in the interest of the population. And so we typically enact mandates. Governor Cuomo said, when he said it's in his order issued last week that everyone stay home, he said it would be nice if you stay home. It's a mandate. You're supposed to stay home. If you don't stay home, except on essential business, you're in violation of the law. There's the same conflict in the climate arena. People buy heavier vehicles because they feel they'll be safer. And it's true, if you're driving one of these 7,000-pound vehicles, you're much safer in a head-on collision with another vehicle than if you're in a small car driving and you're hit by one of these. So it makes sense individually to buy a heavier vehicle, but when others respond in kind and buy heavier vehicles themselves, so everybody's driving a 7,000-pound vehicle, everybody's risk of injury and death goes up, not down. If we had some way of encouraging people to buy smaller vehicles, for example, if we taxed vehicles by weight, that would be in everyone's interest to do. We would raise some tax revenue. That would let us cut taxes on useful activities. In the US, we tax payrolls, which discourages firms from hiring workers. And so it would be much better to tax vehicles by weight and reduce the tax on payrolls. In both cases, these are examples of individual interests and group interests being in conflict. The libertarians complain they don't want to be restricted, and John Stuart Mill, who's the patron saint of libertarianism, articulated very clearly that the only legitimate reason for the government to tell people they can't do what they want to do is to protect prevent them from causing undue harm to others. Protecting yourself is not a good reason, according to Mill, because it would be good for you or the right thing to do. None of that is a legitimate reason for telling you you can't do what you want to do. The only legitimate reason to prevent you from doing what you want to do is to prevent undue harm to others. Well, that's exactly the rationale for the kind of restrictions for the domain. You can't buy a heavy vehicle just because you want to. If you buy one, you cause harm to others. It's therefore legitimate to tax you for buying one. And in the climate domain, you can't go out just because it would be in your interest to go out. If you go out, you harm others. Therefore, you can't go out to the extent that you want to go out. The libertarian objection is met here. These are restrictions we impose on ourselves because we don't think it's justified to cause undue harm to others. In the behavioral arena, one of the very most important drivers of what we spend is the idea of context. So look at the ovals on the screen here. There are 3 of them. Which one is darkest? You probably suspect a trick. It is a trick. In fact, they're all the same shade of gray. But if your brain is functioning normally, the one on the left ought to look darker to you than the other 2. That's because in relation to the surrounding context, it is darker relative to how the others appear as they're embedded in their own context. If the one on the left doesn't look darker, maybe you should schedule an appointment with your doctor. Something's going wrong in your brain if it doesn't look darker of those, the darkest of those 3. It's the same with every evaluation we make. Is it near or far? If you're driving somewhere and your 6-year-old asks, are we almost there yet? If there are 10 miles left on your 12-mile journey, you'll say, no, we're just getting started. If there are those exact same 10 miles left on a 120-mile journey, you'll tell her, yes, we're almost there. We're about to arrive. It's the same when we evaluate what we own. Is my house okay? I was a Peace Corps volunteer long ago in Nepal. I lived in a house, something like this one, 2 rooms, no electricity, no running water. It was an absolutely wonderful house in that context. If I lived in a house like that here, my kids wouldn't have wanted their friends to know where that we lived. We would be ashamed to live in a house like that here. I was never at all embarrassed to invite people to come to my house in Nepal. It's the same house, but in different contexts. This is my house in Ithaca. If my friends in Nepal would see this house, they would think, what on earth would anyone need such a grand house for? Have I taken leave of my senses to buy a house like that? Why so many bathrooms? They'd be astonished. But people here don't think that. This is a house that's actually smaller than the houses that many of my colleagues live in. Context shapes what's normal and acceptable. It's different in different places, in different times, in different social circles. It's different for the wealthy than it is for others. People wag their fingers at the rich for building mansions like this one, but I think that's the same failure of perspective as the reaction of my Nepalese friends would have to my house here in Ithaca. Different standards rule in different areas. But these mansions exist and are as large as they are now because of an interesting change that's taken place in the economy. The reason people are building so much bigger is that, unlike what happened in the 2 decades after World War II, when incomes were growing at about 3% for everybody up and down the income ladder, incomes since about 1970 have been growing almost exclusively at the top. It's the top earners who have gained almost all of the significant income growth in the intervening decades. And so, of course, they're doing what people do at every income layer. When they get more money, they build bigger, they buy more expensive. The people in the middle don't seem offended by the fact that the people at the top of the income ladder are building bigger. That's normal. In fact, they seem to enjoy watching footage of the mansions and the yachts and the helicopters. Maybe they'll be rich someday, they think. Uh, the mansions and the yachts do have an effect, though, on people in the middle. They make it more expensive for them to achieve basic goals that everyone wants to achieve in life. Let me explain how that happens. It's through a process I call expenditure cascade. So the rich build bigger, the rich socialize with the rich. Maybe it's them in their circle to have your daughter's wedding reception in the home instead of in a country club or a rented space in a hotel. And so now the near rich feel they need to build bigger. The people just below them, the near rich, socialize with the near rich. Maybe now it's accustomed to have dinner parties for 18, not 12. They need to build bigger. And it cascades all the way down the income ladder. And without reference to that kind of contagion process, you really can't explain why the median new house has grown so sharply in size since 1970. Look at the increase in square footage. It's now 2,400 square feet. The price of the median house has grown even more sharply than the size of the median square footage of that house. And the median earner, unfortunately, doesn't have higher hourly wages in real terms than in 1970. How are they able to afford such bigger, more expensive houses? The answer is they can't afford them. So why are they buying them? The reason they're buying them is that others like them are buying them. And why are others like them buying them? Because people just above them are buying bigger. And it cascades all the way up to the top of the income ladder, where the first move was the people at the top building bigger. Well, maybe we should just tell people, if you can't afford the big house or the expensive house that you're struggling to carry, that you're working 2 jobs to be able to make ends meet to do, maybe you should just not buy such an expensive house. Here's the rub. There's in every jurisdiction a very clear link between school quality and neighborhood housing prices. If you want your kid to go to a better school, you've got to buy a house in a more expensive neighborhood, because that's where the better schools are. So if you're the median earner and it's your goal to put your kid into a school of just average quality, and we'd think ill of you as a parent if you didn't have at least that level of ambition for your kid's schooling, you've got to buy access to the median price house for your area. Failure to do that means that your kids will go to the schools considered unsatisfactory, the ones with metal detectors out front, and where the other school children are struggling to do well on tests in reading and math. Nobody wants that, and so you're forced to meet the standard set by others for how expensive a house to buy. Cascades have been proceeding in virtually every private consumption area. So in weddings, for example, the average wedding in America was $12,000 in real terms. In 1980, it's 3 times that expense now. Why are weddings so much more expensive? Because other people are spending more, and nobody wants to be in the position of having seemed not to appreciate what an important occasion your daughter's wedding is. There's no evidence whatsoever that when everybody spends more on weddings, the effect is anything other than to raise the bar that defines what people are expected to spend on these kinds of celebrations. There's absolutely no evidence in the happiness literature. It's large, it's contentious. One of the most robust findings in it is that if all the mansions get bigger by half, the people who live in them are no happier or healthier or in any other visible way better off than before. The new larger mansions just become the norm. Are there other ways we could spend the same money? Well, we know the answer to that question. The infrastructure in the US and many other countries is falling into ever deeper disrepair. It's putting lives at risk and damaging us as we try to go about our business. There are ridiculous examples. One from Nevada showed that if you repaired a stretch of interstate highway now, the cost would be $6 million for a short stretch to get the roadbed back to top condition. If you wait just 2 years, that cost escalates up to $30 million. There's no reason not to be spending the money on these things, and yet we wait because we say we don't have the money, even at the same time we're building bigger mansions and spending more on weddings. In the climate domain, you're not supposed to see a 1,000-year flood happen any more often than once every 1,000 years. Ellicott City, Maryland, had 2 of them within a 2 years. The warming trends are increasing much faster than the predictions of just a few years ago. The polar ice caps are melting at an alarming rate. We're seeing incredible increases in the spread of droughts of unprecedented severity. We're seeing wildfires as never before. We could spend the money on climate measures. We could invest in surge capacity in hospitals. We could spend our money in all sorts of ways that we know would make a difference in people's lives, and yet instead we spend it on private consumption items that make, as far as we're able to measure, absolutely no positive effect on people's lives. They're individually rational. If others are buying more expensive houses and you're not, your kids are the ones that go to the inferior schools. So it's individually rational to spend more in the private sector in the ways we're doing. But it's not rational for us as a society. In the medical domain, it's collectively rational to build hospitals with surge capacity sufficient to meet even the most severe pandemic that we might encounter. But if we are relying on a private business model to provide health care, it's not in the interest of individuals to spend in that way. Here's a thought experiment I want to describe to you quickly that illustrates the inherent paradox in the incentives we face to spend our money. I'm going to ask you to imagine 2 worlds. One is a low-tax world. You can think of the United States as the example. In that world, wealthy drivers have a lot of after-tax income, and they buy the Ferrari Berlinetta. It costs $333,000. In the high tax world, let's imagine Norway or one of the Nordic countries, the high tax rates leave wealthy drivers with lower after-tax incomes, and so their choice is to buy the lowly Porsche 911 Turbo. That car costs only $150,000. If the 2 countries were otherwise identical, which country would we expect to see happier wealthy drivers in? Would they be happier in the US or happier in Norway? We don't have firm experimental evidence to answer that question, but the evidence we do have suggests that it would be quite difficult to see any measurable difference in the happiness level of the 2 drivers. Partly that's because by the time you get up to the Porsche 911 Turbo, that's a car that has every feature that has any discernible impact on handling and performance. If it's a worse car than the Ferrari, it's worse by only a tiny magnitude. Those 2 cars are very, very close in absolute terms. What's more, the drivers in the 2 environments are separated. The local standards are what the evidence suggests matters. And so drivers in each case would have the satisfaction of knowing they're driving the best car on the road. So the best guess as to the answer to my question, who's happier, the rich drivers in the US or the rich drivers in Norway, if conditions were the same in every other respects, is that they would probably be equally happy. But what we know is that the conditions other than the 2 cars would not be the same, because the high tax world has more tax revenue. And you can adopt whatever view you like about how wasteful government is. They build bridges to nowhere. They crown welfare queens. They waste money right and left. Fine, adopt that view. Every government spends a large portion of its revenues on public services as well, including road maintenance. And so the real operative question here is not the one I just posed, but rather a different question. Who would be happier? Somebody who drives the Ferrari on roads riddled with foot-deep potholes, that's roughly the experience we have here in the US, or somebody who drives the Porsche on a society with well-maintained roads? That's not even an interesting question. Nobody thinks the driver of the Ferrari on bad roads would be happier. Higher taxes, in this case, stress that the thought experiment is that the higher taxes paid by the wealthy citizens of Norway did not hurt them at all. On the contrary, they made them better off in a very easy to understand way. So here's a question that I ought to have posed to myself much earlier in my career. I regret that I didn't, but I've been thinking about it a lot lately. So if higher taxes would pay for public services and investments that would be much more valuable to the wealthy than the loss they'd suffer by having to reduce their private consumption, which again doesn't seem to matter much when everybody increases it beyond a certain point, why don't they vote for politicians who will enact the policies that we've just seen seem like they would make everybody better off? My answer is that the people who are voting here are suffering from a massive cognitive illusion. I call it the mother of all cognitive illusions because it's led to much bigger losses than any other cognitive illusion yet discovered by behavioral scientists. So first, let me tell you a little bit about cognitive illusions generally. Here's the famous checker shadow illusion. The question is, which square looks darker, A or B? If your brain is functioning normally, your response will be that square A looks darker than square B. That was certainly my response. Since it's an illusion, you've probably guessed that that's not the correct answer. Square A and square B are exactly the same shade of gray. I couldn't believe that when somebody showed me this illusion for the first time. I looked again at the illusion and I said, well, yeah, that's interesting. The explanation for why they might be the same is interesting. It's that the same amount of light enters your eyes from the two squares. It goes to the same visual processing center of the brain. Why doesn't the brain tell you that they have the same shade of gray? The brain also knows one other thing, which is that square B is lying in a shadow, the shadow cast by the cylinder. Therefore, it must be lighter than it appears to us. So your brain, quite outside of your conscious awareness, makes an automatic correction that tells you square B is really lighter than square A. That's what you would want your brain to do. It's an adaptive response. But in fact, the two squares are exactly the same shade in real life. That's a very interesting explanation. When I heard it, I thought, yeah, that sounds plausible. Then I looked at the diagram again, and I said, no, that can't be right. The two squares are just not the same shade of gray. Then I got out my drawing program, and I joined them with a strip that I constructed to be the same shade of gray as square A. And if you look here, you'll see there's absolutely no contrast between that strip and the two squares. They're exactly the same hue. Okay, the point I'm trying to make here is that something can seem obviously true, namely that A is darker than B, and yet it's not true. That's the way the brain works. It's an imperfect instrument. We have to make conclusions about hundreds of things all the time. We don't have much time to think about it. And so we use rules of thumb that work pretty well on average, but they don't give us the right answer in every case. And that's exactly what I propose has happened when we think about what would the effect be if the government raised our taxes to fund more generous investments in hospital capacity and in green energy investment. So
Bob,
Imagine, yeah.
this is Marianne, just a second. Somebody, Marlena asked, is there a title to this specific illusion?
That's the checker shadow illusion.
Checker shadow. And thank you. And I just wanted to also say that several people are raising their hands. Please type any questions in the chat box and we'll ask them. I'm keeping track of them. We'll ask them at the end. We're not calling on people who raise their hands. Okay.
Okay, now I'm going to ask you to imagine you're a wealthy taxpayer and somebody has proposed, I've proposed to raise your taxes to fund greater public investment on climate mitigation and on infrastructure more generally. How do you feel about that? Well, the natural way to think about a question like that is to think back to the last time something like that happened. How did you feel? So you try to do that. That strategy doesn't work in the US, at least in the current environment. This is true in other countries as well, because tax rates have been going steadily downward. In World War II, the top tax rate was 92%. In 1966, the year I graduated from Georgia Tech, it was 70%. In the first year of the Reagan administration. It had fallen to 50%. Now it's 37%. So you can't use how did I feel the last time my taxes went up as a way to think about the effect of higher taxes. So what do you do instead? Well, you do know that higher taxes mean you'll have less money to spend. How did I feel the last time I had less money to spend? And so you try to think back to those times. And if you're a wealthy person, even if you've had a very charmed life, there will have been at least some times when you had less money. Maybe you had a bad business year, you got divorced, you had a house fire, you had a health crisis. Things like this cause you to have less money. And each of those times was a terrible time. You felt terrible when you had less money. And so if that's the way you think about the effect of higher taxes, they're going to leave me with less money. I won't be able to buy what I want. You're right that the times when you had less money did make you less able to buy what you want, but that's an illusion because each of these times when you had less money, were times when you had less money and everybody else had the same amount of money as before. When everyone's taxes go up, you have less money, but so do the people like you have less money. And what are you worried about? You're not worried about being able to buy what you need. Nobody's got a tax proposal that would threaten the ability of a wealthy taxpayer to buy everything he or she needs. Of course not. You're worried about being able to buy the special extras of life that you want, the things that make you happy, a penthouse apartment with a sweeping view. How do you get things like that? There are only so many of them. The way you get them is you have to bid against other people like you who also want them. And here's the key point. When your taxes go up and the taxes of other people like you also go up, relative bidding power is completely unaffected by that. And so the same penthouse apartments with sweeping views of Central Park in New York end up in exactly the same hands as before. What that means is essentially that the rich can pay higher taxes and not have to make any sacrifices at all. And so think about that. This is free money. That's a very radical claim. It sounds implausible. The reason it sounds implausible is that people generally don't think about how the effect of higher taxes would play out in the economy in this way. They suffer from what I'm calling the mother of all cognitive illusions. Let me shift briefly and talk about an issue that's been very contentious in the climate domain, and that's the issue of conscious consumption. It's the term that is used to describe individual actions to reduce your carbon footprint. So in terms of the theme of our seminar, eating meat a little less often would be an individual step that reduces your carbon footprint. That's called conscious consumption. Buying a hybrid car is another such step. installing solar panels. All of these steps reduce your carbon footprint as a result of individual actions that you undertake at some cost to yourself. These steps have been very controversial in the climate conversation for what sounds like a sensible reason. Economists have long objected that these steps suffer from what we call the free rider problem. If I buy a hybrid, that doesn't reduce emissions by much. And if I'm the only one who buys a hybrid, will have no discernible effect at all on the environment. If everyone else buys a hybrid and I don't, that will family on the environment get that same effect, even though I didn't buy a hybrid. And so most people will conclude that it's not worth taking individual actions like that, and they will refrain from taking them. So this is not the strategy we want to rely on to solve the climate crisis. What we need instead is robust changes in public policy. We need a stiff carbon tax. We need massive investment in renewable energy and the like, or we won't make any progress on this front. That's a cogent point of view, and it's one that I held for a long time, but my work on behavioral contagion has caused me to completely change my mind about that. So eating less meat, it's true, that will have, if you do it and you do it alone, that will have a very minimal effect on the outcomes we care about. But as we saw in the case of solar panel adoptions, that's not the end of the impact of your decision to take that step. There's a dramatic increase in solar panel adoption if you adopt solar panels and your neighbors see that you've done that. The same is true for hybrids. The Prius, shown here, looked different from the non-hybrid cars on the road when it was first offered. It sold very briskly because people were proud to make a statement that they were acting in an environmentally responsible way. The Honda Civic hybrid, which looked the same as the gasoline engine hybrid, didn't sell nearly as well. So one point to make is that individual steps, it's true, they have a very small impact on the environment in terms of their direct impact, but the indirect impact is often enormous. And so that's a reason to take these steps, because they have a much, much bigger impact than we previously realized. But the more important reason I changed my mind on this issue is that the act of taking these steps over time changes who you are. As Aristotle stressed, we are what we repeatedly do. We become who we are as people. We aren't born into the world being how we are. We gradually acquire identities and habits and ways of dealing. And so taking acts of individual self-denial in the interest of a common good makes you into a more determined climate advocate. You now are somebody who is more committed to the cause of doing something about the climate. And here's the key step. That makes you much more likely to vote for the candidates who will enact the policies, the carbon taxes, the investments in green energy that we need to adopt if we're to make any real lasting impact on the climate crisis. So conscious consumption, that's a good thing. Think about Greta Thunberg. She must have hoped, she almost certainly didn't expect that her nascent climate crusade would have an impact worldwide. Here she's shown as a 14-year-old. Nobody came to her climate rally. She's disappointed. Hundreds of millions of young people have climbed on board the movement that she helped to launch. It was contagious in a way that she didn't dare imagine, I'm sure. And so you can think about these individual steps of conscious consumption as being akin to buying a lottery ticket. You might have an enormous impact on what happens in the world by taking these steps. Maybe you won't, maybe they'll fizzle out and but you'll almost certainly have an impact beyond what the direct impact of what you yourself do, and you'll make it more likely that we'll end up adopting the policies we need to adopt. So we're really at a point of crisis. We have to think about what policies we want to enact for the the future, and we've got choices to make. We could either continue to do what we've been doing, say uh, let markets take care of everything, and let the game play out as it's been playing out. In that case, we'll have society A, or we could enact higher taxes on wealthy taxpayers and adopt the rules and make the investments that we know would make a difference both in health outcomes, infrastructure quality, and the climate trajectory. And we know too that from the volume of happiness research that wouldn't require any difficult sacrifices on the part of wealthy taxpayers. Which society do we choose? As I'm looking at it, it's an easy call. If I were a billionaire, if I were Michael Bloomberg and had $60 billion, I would go to Pixar. I would hire the animators to make a video explaining why the evidence suggests that society B would be better for almost each and every citizen in it than society A. And I would run it on television frequently and invite people to discuss the question. We're not really discussing it now. We've got a short window in the months after the coronavirus is tamed. We're going to have to make some choices. We will be able to make a real difference. You can't make big changes in society except in the wake of a crisis, as Winston Churchill once said. Never waste a good crisis. We can do something here, but we'll have to act quickly. And the first step to acting will be to have a conversation about what our choices are. That's the formal presentation I wanted to put before you, and I'm happy to engage in whatever ways the organizers dictate from here on out.
Okay, thank you. Thanks a lot, Dr. Frank. This is great. I think we have 214 people on the call right now. And so it's about 12 to 9. And we have some nice comments here. Wonderful presentation, thank you. Applause with about 10 exclamation points, bravo, wow. So, but I'm gonna go to some of the questions that people had during the presentation. I'll take one right now that's just been posted. In the spirit of plant-based diets, are you suggesting that change could be made by taxing meat?
Taxing meat would be a wonderful thing to do. So the libertarians say, well, don't I have a right to eat whatever I want? Again, the mill harm principle says you have a right to do whatever you want as long as you don't cause harm to others. What we know is that eating a meat-rich diet results in much greater CO2 emissions, and that is causing palpable harm to everyone on the planet. And so rather than tell you you're forbidden to eat meat, why not make it less attractive for you to eat meat? If we taxed meat, we could even make that a revenue neutral tax, which means that we collect the revenue from the tax and then we give back that revenue to every low and middle income citizen. So it wouldn't be a burden for even low and middle income families to face a different set of choices in the food market. Meat more expensive, plant-based foods less expensive. That would get people to shift toward plant-based foods. And as more people did that, contagion would take the reins. What we know is that food choices are highly contagious. Atkins diet, South Beach diet, keto diet, all these diets are incredibly contagious. What people eat depends enormously on what their friends, neighbors, and relatives eat. And so, yes, taxing meat would be a great step to take.
Marianne, we cannot hear you. Are you asking more questions?
I'm not hearing anything at my end.
I think she's muted. Oh, okay, hear you. Hi, Marianne.
Thank you.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, yeah, just keep me unmuted. I'm sorry if I'm typing, but or just unmute me after Dr. Frank stops talking, because, okay. So I think there's a lot of questions on the meat tax. Also some questions on taxing plastic, all sort of carbon intensive products. So I think one of the concerns is, how are people going to react? Like a meat tax, I mean, you know that there would be a very negative reaction in the US. So maybe if you can address that.
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. And first examples of political malpractice that I've ever seen. Leaders have proposed carbon taxes. Economists have said for more than a century that's the way to best deal with the problem of pollution and other things that cause harm, activities that cause harm to others, to tax them. Whenever leaders have proposed that, they've faced enormous pushback. Voters have demonstrated in the streets. The Gilets jaunes in France shut down the fuel tax that Macron tried to impose. To get this tax enacted, a tax on carbon, that's the very most important step that we can take apart from massive investment in renewable energy sources. To get that adopted, it's critically important to make it revenue neutral. That means we take in all the revenue from the carbon tax. And here's the key point about carbon emissions. Worldwide, the top 10th of the income distribution emit 90% of the carbon. They use 90% of the energy worldwide. Most of the revenue that comes in from a carbon tax would come in from people at the top of the income ladder. If we then take all the money that comes in and give it back in monthly rebate checks to mostly low and middle income families, we could design a scheme under which 90% or more of all voters would get more money back each month than they'd paid in carbon taxes. Why would any voter rebel against a proposal like that? It's just a matter of failure to explain to them what the logic of the tax would be. We can explain this. Let's get the videos made and put them on TV explaining why a carbon tax implemented in this way would not make your life more difficult. It would reduce emissions immediately and dramatically, and it would get us where we need to get to in a way that we're not going to arrive if we don't do this.
So one other question about the meat tax, and I'm not capturing all the questions because they're coming fast and furious, but how about, instead of taxing meat, subsidizing vegetables and fruits so they're less expensive?
That's, from a theoretical point of view, that's exactly equivalent. What's important is to change the relative attractiveness of the two types. You can do that by taxing the type you want to see less of, or by subsidizing the one you want to see more of. You could even do both.
And there's a question from somebody in China about, do you have any insights on different approaches one might take in China versus other countries, or just say versus the US?
I think the U.S. is uniquely challenged because the libertarian objection has the greatest force here than in almost any other country on the planet. Recall from the first part of the presentation that what the viral contagions and the behavioral contagions have in common is that what it's in my individual interest to do is often squarely in conflict with what it's in our interest that we all do. And here there's a very powerful and almost instinctive reaction against any rules that limit what the individual can do. In China, there is much less of that reaction just because of the way society is organized there. So I think we're handicapped in a special way in responding to these two problems. So what we would expect, therefore, is that if the government in China wanted to take action on both the health front and the climate front, it would be able to do so more quickly than the governments in the U.S. are able to do. That's not to say that we should abandon our way of government. We are perfectly capable of taking the actions we need to take, but we better get moving, and we better have the discussion sooner rather than later.
Mhm. Okay, thank you. And there's a question from Fatma Sabeh. I am a PhD researcher, and I wonder what research methodologies would you see compatible to making societal changes? Pretty big question.
Yeah, well, I think the whole contagion subject is one that's just now getting the serious attention it deserves from researchers. I think contagion is both the source of the problems that we're facing in the two crises that are most important at the moment, but it also is a two-sided coin. It holds the solution to the two crises. And so the more we know about how to engage peer pressure effectively in changing people's behavior, the more quickly we'll arrive at rational solutions to both of these problems.
Okay, great. And I just want to ask you, because we have 3 more minutes till 9, are you, Dr. Frank, are you able or willing to stay on to answer more questions, or should we cut it off exactly at 9?
No, I'm happy to stay on. And Marianne, can I ask people if they're on Twitter? My Twitter handle is at EconNaturalist, EconNaturalist. Maybe you could put that in the notes. This is a really important conversation to have, and I think social media is turning out to be one of the most efficient ways to make the conversation spread more widely, more rapidly. And so I'm really doing everything I can think of to that end, and any help people are in a position to offer, I'd be extremely grateful.
We have somebody that's asking about the carbon Fee and Dividend that Citizens Climate Lobby vouches for, and they're wondering on your take on that.
That's exactly a revenue neutral carbon tax that I've just described. And sure enough, their term is better than my term, because my term has the term tax in it, and that makes people get nervous and angry and worried. Carbon Fee and Dividend, way better marketing label than the one I was using.
Okay, great, thank you. Ravikant Dubey asks how to develop a thinking as we know our brain uses comparative approach in picking choices.
You wouldn't want your brain not to use frames of reference for thinking about important problems. That's a heuristic that sends us in the right direction most of the time. I think the challenge is to recognize when our individual incentives are in conflict with our group incentives, and to take reasoned measures to change individual incentives in those cases. Taxes and subsidies are terrific devices for doing that, but sometimes we need stricter rules that give people no latitude about changing. So in the case of stay-at-home orders, there we need a mandate. We don't need to tax you for going out. We need to tell you can't go out.
Okay, so we have a question from Maya, and she says that she is an environmental educator working with young people. Do you have any suggestions for those of us who are working with young people?
The last chapter of my book talks about how you can better communicate with people who don't agree with you in the first place. Children aren't in that category, but I think some of the lessons of the research that bears on the earlier question also is useful there. And the main finding is to try to ask the right question to get the listener to conclude for her or himself that an idea is worth adopting. So if you think about One example in my own experience was in conversations I had with opponents of the Affordable Care Act, which is the American attempt to provide broader health coverage for the population. Opponents of that measure didn't like the fact that it required people to buy health insurance. That was a violation of their freedom, they argued. And you could try to explain to them why they couldn't really have access to insurance on terms they favored unless they had a requirement that everyone buy. But you could never make any progress by trying to make that argument. Instead, what if you asked them the following question? What would happen if the government required people to buy, if the government required fire insurance companies to sell fire insurance to people at affordable rate after their houses had already burned down? People would think about that question only briefly and quickly conclude that, well, if the government required that, fire insurance companies would go bankrupt because nobody would buy insurance until his home had already burned down. And in the healthcare arena, everybody liked the requirement that people be able to buy health insurance, even if at affordable rates, even if they had a pre-existing condition. And they immediately saw that unless everybody was in the pool, no health insurance company could sell insurance to people with pre-existing conditions on those terms. You had to have a mandate that kept people in the pool. In the fire insurance market, people would be in the pool because they didn't know whether the house would burn down. In the health market, you know you have a pre-existing condition, and so does the insurance company, and you need a mandate in that case. So asking the right question is a great strategy for conversations with adults who don't agree with you. It's a great strategy for getting kids to think about the things you want them to learn.
Okay, thank you. So we had a few questions a while back from Latin America and from Cape Town, South Africa, about people living, you know, in very impoverished conditions. They don't have houses in high density, and they're not obeying directives. And so, yeah. So, you know, what do you suggest in those situations?
You know, it's a tragedy. Sheltering in place, one Indian doctor pointed out, is something you can do if you're privileged. If you're not privileged, it's almost impossible to shelter in place. And he's absolutely right. Wash your hands frequently. Well, many people in the world don't have running water. How can you wash your hands frequently? And that's a deep tragedy. I think the countries that can help with resources for the places that don't have it, by all means, let's rush to the aid of people who are not in a position to do what's necessary. Even in the countries that in general have too few resources for people to do what's necessary, there are many people within those countries who do have the resources, and those people should be called upon to step up to assist in those cases.
Okay, thank you. We also had a bunch of questions about social media and its role in influencing behaviors.
You know, we have an impulse to do what other people around us do. Sometimes that leads us astray, as when we smoke when our friends smoke, but oftentimes it's a totally useful impulse to be at least inclined to investigate whether you ought to be doing what others seem to be deciding is in their interest to do. So social media really amplifies that manyfold, and I think we've got to take much more of a direct interest in trying to steer that to our advantage. We've got leverage as never before. There was an attempt to start the Me Too movement in 2007. That attempt fizzled. When a similar attempt started in 2017, it went viral almost overnight all around the world. And now the issue of sexual harassment in the workplace is in a position it never could have been in the absence of social media. we've got to find ways to exploit that possibility more to our advantage going forward, and to limit the harm that comes from misuse of social media in a more active way. I think we've taken the position too often that, well, people are free to do whatever they choose. In general, fine, as long as they're not causing harm to others. If what they're doing is harming others, we have an interest in limiting their ability to do that. If what they're doing is helping others, we should encourage them to do things like that. And we're not doing either of those things very effectively as yet.
Thank you. And then Charlotte, I think this is following up on something you said earlier, you know, how can we use the crisis to influence people's behavior? So her question is, what do you think we or the government can do during the virus outbreak to promote plant-based diet?
You know, I think the focus during the COVID crisis is going to be almost exclusively on that. Let's imagine how things will play out. I'm focused on the U.S. naturally because that's where I live. Our government our federal government has completely mismanaged the crisis. There is going to be a period of intense post-mortem analysis following the emergence from this crisis. And I mean that in the most unfortunate literal way. There are going to be maybe hundreds of thousands of people who died needlessly because we took the view that the best way to run a country is to let people do whatever they want, no matter how much harm it causes other people. There's going to be a very ready appetite for discussion of what to do when it's clear that the interests of the individual are in conflict with the interests of the broader society. We're going to have a window of opportunity to consider policies for helping to align the interests of individuals and the interests of society more closely, while doing minimal damage to the freedom of individuals to pursue their own legitimate interests to the maximum possible extent. We've got to seize that moment when it comes. I think to go full tilt in pursuit of a plant-based diet now is going to have minimal impact if you have limited energy and have a choice between focusing on that and focusing on ending the immediate crisis of the epidemic. There's no question in my mind, but to focus my own energy on the second. But we'll have an opportunity to act in a way that we won't have had before and that we won't soon have again. We've got to seize that opportunity when it comes.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm going to just follow up on that question just myself. So,
okay.
You know, I've in the past couple of weeks written, you know, little notes to my representatives in Congress about tying the stimulus packages to you know, low carbon options. And so what would you think is the most effective thing people can do? I know it's going to vary between countries, but you're saying there's going to be a discussion, which is great. But as an individual, you know, do you have any suggestions what we can do to
I mean, anything that we can introduce into these relief bills that will at the same time attack the climate issues we're all concerned about, by all means, that seize that moment too. We're going to be coming out of the crisis once the epidemic is under control. We're going to be in a very deep recession, by all accounts, deeper maybe even than the Great Depression of the 1930s. We're going to have to take extreme measures to stimulate additional economic activity, and the idea of bailing out fossil fuel companies and cruise ship lines as part of that response ought to be just laughed out of court. that's the time when we ought to be investing in the changes that we need to make on the climate front. Now, there's not going to be a better opportunity ever to do that. And any bill that's under consideration right now, of course, should have that as part of it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Sort of in another issues, well, related to climate, but there were a bunch of questions on both public transportation and on plastics in relation to climate.
You know, if we had, let me get the term right. If we had a carbon fee and dividend policy, the principle would be established that if the purchases you make cause harm to others, it's totally appropriate to make them less attractive by using fiscal measures like that. So if plastics are causing harm to others, and it's clear that they are, then those measures ought to be change that. So yeah, that's absolutely fair game.
Mm-hmm. And then I think we're sort of, there's still a few questions coming, but one person asked about how do you address the issue of food deserts if you're trying to promote climate or plant-rich diet?
Yeah, it's heartbreaking to realize that many people live in places where their best effort to adopt a healthful diet is frustrated by lack of food availability. So yes, there are public policies we can adopt that will make food more available in those places, and it's again, the policies will cost money, but the point that we take from the very large, very contentious happiness literature, the literature on the determinants of human flourishing, is that money is available essentially free of charge. That we are spending money to build bigger houses across the board when we know that the effect of that is merely to raise the bar that defines adequate. Use some of that money to achieve these other goals that we know would matter to real people's ability to flourish in life.
Okay, thank you. I think that's about it, but I do have one last sort of observation question, and that is, we have done an online fellowship similar to the online course where we had people each choose a climate action, and then they tried to persuade their network to take that action alongside of them. And those who use this sort of face-to-face or, you know, kind of following the clustered network findings of Damon Santola. So for example, they had people over and had meals together, had much more success than those who tried to say, ask all their Instagram followers to post, you know, a plant-rich meal, a photo.
Yeah.
Instagram. So I think social media for us, if we're not an influencer, might be limited. And I was wondering what you thought about that.
Yeah, I think that's a terrific point. And you know, one of the things that makes people reluctant to change their diet is that we're naturally creatures of habit. I know when my sons were small, it was the hardest thing each day to get them into the bath. They didn't want to stop whatever it was they were doing and get in the bath. Once they were in the bath, the last thing they wanted was to get out of the bath. So we're just creatures of inertia. We do what we're doing. We don't want to change what we're doing. And I think if you invite someone over for a meal and you serve a plant-based meal that's really good tasting, many people who eat the traditional diet in America aren't aware that there are really fantastic tasting options that don't involve any meat. And experiencing that firsthand has got to be just a radically different thing than hearing on Instagram that somebody had a meal that they liked. So absolutely, I think that's a valid point to stress.
All right, well, oh, we do have one more question if you don't mind.
I got all day.
Okay, but can peer pressure be used to control the population growth rate? That's from Hannah Abdullahi.
Oh, can peer pressure be used to control population growth? Yeah, one of the early studies was that the number of children people choose to have is very heavily influenced by the choices made by other people in the same local environment. That shouldn't be a surprise since virtually every behavior is contagious, we're now learning, but that's one of the earliest findings demonstrating that that particular one was contagious. So the answer is yes.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Frank. I know we had, I think, 214 at the peak. I don't know if UA wants to unmute herself and just sort of talk about what's happening next for those who speak Chinese. Everybody, if you don't speak Chinese, you probably want to get off now because the discussion will continue in the Chinese language. But I also wanted to remind you that we have, I'm pretty sure it's Elizabeth Fox next week, who is an author on the Lancet Climate and Health Diet report. So tune in next week. Sign up for our Network Climate Action course. And yeah, keep in touch. And thank you so much, Dr. Frank. Really appreciate
my pleasure. Yeah, thank you for
time.
inviting me to do this. I was happy to help.
Thank you so much, Dr. Frank. And Marianne, we're going to have a Chinese session. Actually, we have a quick question from Chinese participants, if you don't mind, Dr. Frank. So you talked about two scenarios, Society A and Society B. And then they just wonder, do you have, like, maybe you already talked about this, but so do you have like examples of which countries are like the Society A, which countries are Society B? If you can give just a few examples.
The example I did of the high tax country and the low tax country, I think, is directly responsive to that specific question. The Nordic countries are social democracies. They have organized their social safety net in a way that's much more cognizant of the disparity between individual interest and society interests than countries like the United States or even the UK. The UK is intermediate between those two examples. So a friend once remarked to me that in the Nordic countries where he had worked for a few years, a friend had told him that people are much happier here because the things you worry most about are things we don't have to worry about at all. And he said, well, what are those things? What happens if I get sick? That's something we don't worry about in the Nordic countries. In the US, you worry, do you have insurance? Even if you have insurance, are you going to be able to carry the extra bills you're going to be hit with? That's not a worry for them. How am I going to retire? That's all financed by government revenue to a much greater extent in the Nordic countries than it is here, where it's much more seen as your own responsibility to save for retirement, which is because individual and group interests are in conflict, very difficult to do. If your neighbors are taking their savings and bidding for houses in better school districts and you don't, then it's your kids who go to the bad schools. So it's very hard to save for retirement on your own. It's much easier for the government to tax you and give you retirement income support when you're retired. And the third thing is, how am I going to educate my kids? And here, people are buried under mountains of debt when it comes time to send their kids to college. That's much less the case in the Nordic countries, where the cost of education is shouldered collectively and where they've had much less of an arms race of expenditure on higher education than we've seen here.
Great. Well, thank you so much. This is a great webinar. And we will, Chinese participants, we're going to just summarize your key points and in Chinese to share with those who can had hard time to understand English. Thank you so much.
Okay, so I'll sign off and thank you all again for setting this up. This was a good experience for me.
Great, thank you. It was great to see how many questions there were, how involved people are. So
terrific.